As we approach Easter and start thinking about and considering the resurrection of Jesus, one resurrection story that a lot of people are familiar with and that gets talked about a lot this time of year is the story of Thomas. Now, most of you know Thomas probably as doubting Thomas or the disciple who doubted. Thomas is one of the 12 apostles. And this story that gets him the name Doubting Thomas comes from John chapter 20, where after Jesus has been raised from the dead, Thomas says that he will not believe that Jesus has truly been raised until he can see the marks from the nails in Jesus' hands. And he can touch those marks in his hands and the spear mark in Jesus' side. And then eventually Jesus shows up. He speaks to Thomas and he says, look, you can see the marks and you can touch them with your own hands. And then in John chapter 20 and verse 27, Jesus says, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe. And so Thomas becomes known as the apostle who doubted, doubting Thomas, who doubts the resurrection of Jesus. But the interesting thing is that the word doubt does not occur in the passage. When Jesus says, don't doubt, but believe, what he literally says in the Greek of John is, do not be unbelieving, but believe. Or do not lack faith, but have faith. Come to faith. Jesus isn't saying that Thomas is doubting, but merely that Thomas has not yet come to belief or faith in Jesus' resurrection. Something else that's interesting is if you go all the way to the beginning of John chapter 20, where Mary Magdalene discovers the empty tomb and Jesus appears to her and tells her to go tell the disciples what has happened. Mary goes to the disciples and says, I have seen the Lord. But the disciples don't believe Mary. Jesus later that night appears to the disciples and shows the other disciples the nail marks in his hands and the mark from the spear in his side. And then the disciples believe or have faith. But Thomas is not a part of this initial encounter with Jesus. And so when Thomas comes back and speaks with the disciples tell Thomas as well, we have seen the Lord. The very same thing that Mary had told them. But Thomas doesn't believe that the disciples have seen the Lord, just like the disciples don't believe that Mary has seen the Lord. And that's when Thomas says he needs to see the marks in Jesus' hands and his side, the very thing the rest of the disciples needed to see in order to believe. You see, Thomas doesn't have a lesser faith than the rest of the disciples or even of Mary. He's not doubting, he's just not yet come to belief. He needs to interact and to see the resurrected Jesus, just like Mary and the rest of the disciples were able to do. And so when Jesus shows up and allows Thomas to see and to touch, Thomas comes to faith. He believes that Jesus has been raised. You see, the point of this story is not what Thomas needs in order to believe. The point isn't that Thomas doubted and shouldn't have. That's not how John presents him. The point of the story is not that Thomas needed to see the marks in Jesus' hands and his side. But the point of the story is what Jesus will do to bring people to faith. Jesus escapes a closed tomb to speak to Mary, and Mary believes. Jesus comes behind a locked door to speak to the disciples and to show them his hands and his side, and the disciples believe. He then appears a little while later behind another locked door to Thomas and says, in essence, Thomas, I know these things that you say that you need in order to believe, and here I am. Here are the marks in my hands and my side, everything that you said that you needed. The reason that John tells us this story is to show the links that the resurrected Jesus goes to bring people to faith, and I think that even applies to today. How we continue to encounter the resurrected Jesus in worship and in the church and in relationships and in music and film and in God's creation. We continue to encounter the resurrected Jesus. The resurrected Jesus continues to go to great lengths to encounter us and to bring us to faith. And like with Mary and with Thomas and with the other disciples, Jesus provides us with the very things that we need to believe in him.